I'll admit, first of all, that my knowledge of India is quite limited. Consequence of that, in order to provide some use to you from my own perspective, I'm more going to focus on the world and try to allow you, from my perspective, to get a grasp of how I see the world, and if that view of the world is useful to you in some way or other and allows you to get a perspective on your own condition through a comparative analysis of the way the world is, then I've served my purpose of saying something to you today. The idea of an epochal change in India, or an epochal change in the world, I think is something that is valid, and I'll talk more on that type of angle than on anything else. My life has been spent since I was about 17 engaging in what I believe to be trying to bring about revolutionary change. By revolutionary change, I mean transformation in the existing structure of society, order of society, through mobilizing people, organizing people, explaining ideas which I believe can impact on how they envisage the world and transform the world. And one of the things that's happened in the last few months, I'm sure you're quite aware, is that in both America and in Britain, there's been a fundamental political transformation take place around two individuals. And often in history, necessity expresses itself through accidents, and that's precisely what seems to have happened both with the campaign in the Democratic Party for Bernie Sanders and the campaign in the Labour Party in Britain for Jeremy Corbyn. I've been campaigning alongside Ishmael and others in Britain for Jeremy Corbyn's election in the last 2 months, and it was literally an accident. It was just a few people happened to sign a piece of paper with members of Parliament and said, okay, we'll put this guy on the ballot paper just so we've got like a strange creature from the past talking about issues which people were interested in once upon a time, but in reality are no longer interested in. And what it revealed was that during the course of this debate for the last 2 months in Britain, it's exposed that there is a real deep-seated, alienated voice amongst the people that has not found expression, and that Jeremy Corbyn suddenly lit a fuse to, and that the whole of British society, or better said, the whole of the Labour movement and supporters of the Labour movement, have been able to galvanize around. Yesterday, for example, there was a television discussion between the various candidates in the Labour Party leadership election. There are 4 candidates, for those who don't know. One of them is on the far left, Jeremy Corbyn, and the others are standard, relatively well-recognized politicians. And in this debate, at the end of the debate, they asked people to give their viewpoint, and around 80% said they supported Jeremy Corbyn. Or if you've seen the rallies of Bernie Sanders in the United States of America, where he rails against the existing class structure in the United States of America, against the grotesque inequalities that developed in America, against the power of billionaires, against the power of corporate lobbies, against the disenfranchisement of the mass of the population, against the misuse of power, against the misuse of police power, for example, in Ferguson, the ongoing riots and conflicts, about the pretense that politics and the establishment have raised up as the norm and presented to people through television, through the privately owned television stations as well as state-owned television stations, as reality, and the response of the mass of people towards this opening that Bernie Sanders has given reveal that there's a giant disparity between what we are told is the truth and what is presented as the truth and what millions and millions of people who feel disenfranchised believe the truth is. And that's what we've seen with Bernie Sanders. For example, in Bernie Sanders campaigns, you've had, in Iowa, I saw a rally of around 26,000 people attended, whereas Hillary Clinton could get maybe 2,000, 3,000 people or a few thousand people in a hall. So this is, in my opinion, an illustration in two of the most fundamental, powerful countries in the history of the 20th century and the history of the 21st century of an epochal shift in consciousness and politics. I thought to myself when I was invited to come to this meeting, what on earth am I going to talk about? How on earth am I going to connect to people who are from India, who are from the type of strata which you're from, the type of interest which you're from? And then as the campaign in Britain began to develop, I actually put in an application last week for a job as an advisor to the shadow cabinet. I doubt I'll get it, but I did apply. Because such is the shift in the balance of intellectual discussion in Britain as a consequence of this process inside the Labour Party, and the same process in the United States, that I believe that what I'm advocating, or what I've been advocating for around 30 years, has validity and also will have an impact inside Britain and around the rest of the world. Not because it's from me or anything like that, but because I think it's expressing something fundamental that has been ignored over a long period of time, certainly up until the world economic crisis began, or the modern world economic crisis began in 2008, and is extended around the world and is reflected in a whole series of conflicts which we're seeing take place around the world. In the newspapers today, there are articles of focusing on the migrant crisis, or better said, the refugee crisis. And in Britain, for many months, the discussion was entirely focused on how do we stop the foreigners coming in? How do we stop, these people coming in and taking our jobs and taking our facilities and claiming benefits and so on? That debate shifted, as one of the Indian newspapers this morning reported, shifted over the last few days to almost overwhelming majority supporting the acceptance of refugees, even in Britain. And the government has now, according to the newspapers I saw this morning, the government has now capitulated to this and agreed that they will take more refugees than they would have done only a week ago. Because the mood shift reflects something that has been taking place under the surface. At a micro level, this accumulation of discontent, this feeling that something is wrong, this inability to articulate it, but eventually when it finally finds expression, then a floodgate opens and masses of people enter into the process and bring about change. That's what I mean by revolution. That's the definition, if you like, in my concept of what revolutionary change is. Revolutionary change, the entry of millions of people who've been excluded from politics, from social life, from cultural life, into activity to bring about change. Now, are we not in such an epoch? Yesterday, people discussed the question about what's happening in India. And someone said, well, social media is a positive platform for people to challenge the existing power relations in society. Well, that's perfectly true. I saw something again about Jeremy Corbyn yesterday, and it said, this is the victory for pig-ignorant fools on the internet who click and say they like this and say they like that and say they like that and can express themselves. But really what we're talking about is a raising awareness within the population, not only in Britain or America or in India, but on a world scale. And so the world transformation is how I want to contextualize the question first, and then try and allow you to if you like, allow any of us to identify where our position is within that world. So I'm going to do a little bit of a generic overview of the global historical context, and then try and draw things together to try and allow you to gain something out of what I'm saying. I lived in East Germany at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. I participated in the revolution there. I wanted to see change to that society. I was not a Stalinist. I didn't believe in that type of regime. I believed in some form of democratic socialism. Now, socialism and capitalism was discussed by, I believe it was a vice minister or minister yesterday who spoke here, as a generic theme that has affected Indian society as well. Well, although Tony Blair and others argued that these ideas have disappeared and that the idea of socialism is irrelevant, actually what we're discovering is that, like I said, in America and in Britain, it is returned to the center stage of discussion, even though everyone had said it had disappeared and was utterly irrelevant. If you take the crisis in Greece or the crisis in Spain, we have a very similar scenario. People said that socialism would never gain a majority of support, and out of the blue, a tiny and irrelevant party composed of all sorts of peculiar sects of left-wing groups came together, and because of the utter incapacity of the existing order to establish its authority and maintain economic growth and development for the population in Greece, the homeland of democracy, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, because of their utter incapacity to do that, the society entered a period of profound crisis where millions of people were discontented. tried to bring about change through the existing political parties, and then when that was impossible, suddenly they elected a new party. That new party then came under the diktats of the IMF, the European Union, the ECB, and was forced to capitulate. Well, they could have resisted. I believe they should have resisted. Tsipras and Syriza should have resisted, in my opinion. But in any case, the point being that found electoral expression in the election of Syriza, and that discontent reflects a profound revolutionary crisis not only in Greece but all across Europe. In Germany, we've had a process of development to the right. On the one side, you've had people burning down migrant refugee centers. You've had people complaining. But then yesterday, there was an opinion poll in Germany. 93% of the German population support accepting unlimited quantities of refugees from Syria. Now, I found that quite astounding. I believed it would be about 30-40% because I've got some family who've told me things, extremely reactionary things, that led me to think that the mood in Germany would be in the opposite direction. For that to shift so radically in favor is again an indication that what we are told is what people's thinking is, and what the reality of people's underlying thinking can be or is profoundly distorted from another. I saw Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of Britain, the leader of the Labour Party, last leader of the Labour Party in government, talk against Jeremy Corbyn a few weeks ago at a meeting, and he stomped up and down. Some of you might have seen it on BBC or something. He stomped up and down for about an hour complaining about and giving a potted history of the British Labour movement, complaining about Jeremy Corbyn and giving a potted history. And then what he did was he said, the idea of commanding heights, in other words, the idea of the dominant sectors of economy being in public ownership and this facilitating a transformation in society towards socialism, is passé. It cannot be done because now the commanding heights are threefold. One is communications technology, the other is finance, and the other is information. This was the argument that Gordon Brown made. And I think it has some validity. And it reflects the dynamics of globalization, that you have finance, communications technology, and information as dominant sectors in the world economy and dynamically affecting each national government, such that every single political party will turn around and say, well, there's nothing we can do because global finance will wreck us if we don't do this. And that's exactly what they did with Greece. They waterboarded the Greek government until they agreed to capitulate to German more to German and European demands than to the IMF. But in any case, to the interests of the international financiers who demanded that Greece abide by the policies imposed upon them. In other words, austerity, cutbacks, driving down the living standards of the mass of the people. So how can finance, information, and communications as decisive levers of economic and thereby of political power be transformed into something else? I believe that it is possible to take the banks on a global scale into public ownership, and if they're not taken into public ownership, to create in national states banks which are serving the public need and thereby accumulating resources from private sector banks into state sector banks. And that means that the state has to give direct support to those banks, for example, by offering more security for money lent to state banks than to private banks, offering higher interest rate returns on state banks than private banks, and utilizing state banks as public investment vehicles rather than private banks which focus almost entirely on private sector lending. Information. That's a much more complicated question. How do you make information a medium which serves the general public? I think there are two aspects to it. One is you can turn around and say, okay, you could say something like we would nationalize one aspect of one private software company, or we would break up software companies or internet companies that have too much power, for example, Google or Microsoft. Or alternatively, you could turn around and say, we will provide large-scale state support at all levels, from microfinance to large-scale finance, for software companies that are designed to produce software for public use. For example, the idea that Amazon has some monopoly on how to sell things on the internet, or the idea that Facebook has some monopoly on how people can communicate across the world, or the idea that Google has some monopoly on finding information into the future simply because it's already arrived at that position, I believe is rubbish. I believe it's perfectly possible to finance and support organizations which undermine and destroy the power of these companies that have become too powerful and globally influence the shape of the world, including transferring data and information about every single one of you and even our government ministers, negotiators, United Nations officials and so on, to the National Security Agency of the United States of America in order for them to use it against you. I don't believe that that power has to be accepted or should be accepted. And I believe that we have to think on a global scale about how to transform the balance of power between the mass of people on a world scale and the institutions which control the communications which we make between each other and across the entire planet. The argument was made during the Arab Spring that communications technology facilitated the revolution. Well, to some degree. Although in 1848 there were revolutions across the whole of Europe, they didn't have any telecommunications at that time. I think the telegram was as far as they'd got at that time. So the idea that revolutions spring entirely from communications, I don't think is right. But on the other side, the reorganization of how the world is organized between consumer and producer can be and should be and will be determined by how we take control and organize communications across the world into the future. And as I said, I think the primary question there is about financing and supporting projects that on a large scale challenge the existing structure of these institutions and organizations, as well as utilizing when you get power, for example, like if Jeremy Corbyn is elected Labour Party leader, when he comes to power, then they should be able to break up the power of these organizations and undermine them through, for example, challenging their relations to the National Security Agency or the Secret Services in Britain, GCHQ and so on. In relation to communications, I think, again, the question here really revolves around what mechanisms, what tools are these really involved in? Because I think we have to think into the future. You know, everybody nowadays, they talk about that. They've got this little drone thing, you know, you can fly a little instrument that has a little helicopter that's got a little camera on it and can record things. But of course, what really is happening is that software, biotechnology, nanotechnology, the technologies of the future that will dominate the dynamics of the development of capitalism in the next 20, 30 years, or the development of alternatives to capitalism in the next 20, 30 years, these instruments of communication, these instruments that govern the fate of our bodies and lives, these instruments that at the moment are things that we carry around with us and play with us all day long. I know people who pull these things out all day long and play around with them all day long. These instruments are going to disappear into our body or effectively disappear from our sight. And once things are out of sight, they're out of mind often. And I would prefer that we think carefully about how we structure the utilization of technology and information and communications now in order to seize control of these things for the public good so that the people control what is done with the technology and resources of the future rather than corporate interests grabbing and utilizing our information, our knowledge, our ideas for their purposes. One case in point that my brother pointed out to me a number of years ago, which I'll end on, is this. Google, for example. Google is hailed as the great savior of mankind. Google provides something that, for example, Karl Marx promised communism would provide, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. If you go on Google, you can use Google, search for information, find information about gods and so on. We can look up all those things. But on the other side, what's actually happening is all of us, including the richest people on earth, are being turned into proletarians by Google because every single activity you do becomes a product that they own because they seize from you what your work is. You give them your information, ideas, activities, your communications, your connections, your translations, your concepts, your beliefs. You give them that for free, and they accumulate that, package it, and sell it as a product on the marketplace ad infinitum into the future. We must take control of the resources that exist in this planet, not only simple economic resources like commanding heights in the old phrase, but also the commanding heights into the future. That, I believe, is essential in order to create the foundations for a better society which we can live in. Thanks.